Wade 3 times, 3 ways. Where's Wade? Lots of chatter about time, age, longevity, extreme longevity. This is Wade about turning 65.
I changed my clothes so you wouldn't realize it was me. Otherwise, the tomatoes would be in midair by the third talk. Thanks, Moses. I didn't know we had entered sort of the X-rated section of the program here. I think this is the last talk, so it may be just in time. Some years ago, I received an honorary doctorate at McGill, and I was asked to do a commencement speech for a faculty that included a lot of students who were, had business careers and gone back to finish their degrees. Many of them were in their late 30s, some even in their 40s. And I was uncertain as to what message you should deliver in a commencement address. And I happened to be in Telluride at a film festival, and I ran into an old friend of mine, Chris Riley, who always has a thoughtful thing to say. He invented the slogan, "Just do it," for Nike, and he later launched the iPhone with Steve Jobs. So I asked Chris over a drink, what should I say to these kids who weren't kids? And without hesitation, he just bellowed at me one number, 65. And I knew immediately what he was talking about. And do you? Why do we have that arbitrary number? I'm sure some of you know. It was Bismarck in the 19th century when he attempted to quell labor unrest in the Kaiser's Germany, and he brought in what we would now to see to be one of the first sort of social security programs, but he wanted to make damn sure that the state would never have to pay out. So he went to the actuary tables and he selected arbitrarily an age at which almost all the potential recipients would statistically be dead. And that's why we retire at 65. And of course, what Chris had done is he had been about to retire with oodles of money and decided that he wouldn't because he read an article saying that the average life expectancy for an affluent Caucasian male on the west coast of California was now 90. Now, I don't know if it's really that high, but what he obviously recognized is that both he was facing another 30 years of active life, and these young students who I would address were going to probably be looking at 40 to 50 years of active life, and they certainly shouldn't be thinking that they had missed out or that they were somehow too late. So when I spoke to the kids, I ended up revisiting many of the words that I had shared at my own daughter's college graduation a few years before. And the first thing I mentioned to those students, and I think some of this advice was remarkably apropos to someone who has just turned 65, which something just happened to me, as a matter of fact. First of all, there are tens of thousands of teachers out there that you didn't even know you had. You can sail with Polynesian wayfinders who can sense the presence of distant atolls beyond the visible horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel. Or you can run with the Tende monks of Kyoto, who over the course of their initiation run the equivalent of the circumference of the earth, 17 hours a day for multiple years, wearing out 5 pairs of sandals each day. Or you can hunt narwhal beneath the light of the midnight sun with the Inuit, sit at the side of a shaman in the Amazon or the side of a bodhisattva in a Tibetan cave. I also said to the students that life was not linear or predictable, that a career was not something that you tried on like a coat, just like a life is not something that you try on like a coat. Everything builds around you step by step, choice by choice. Everything adds up. Nothing in life is beneath you unless you make it so. No work is unuseful unless you see it as that. And a taxi cab driver can have as much to teach you as a professor or a wandering sadhu or a madman in the Sahara. I remember once I was in a cab in DC and an African-American driver looked a little elderly, and I said to him, sir, I don't mean to be rude, but you do look a little bit old to be driving cab in this tough town. And he turned to me and he said, son, how old do you think I am? I said, son, sir, you could be, your late 70s. He leans back to me and says, son, I'm 97 years old. And I said, shit. I said, man, what's your secret? And he leaned back at me and said, "Son, I don't worry about a fucking thing." And to me, that was an example of wisdom as opposed to knowledge. And I also said to the young students, as I would say to anybody, that if you place yourself in the way of opportunities in the situations where there is no choice but success, you suddenly find yourself capable of achieving things that would have been beyond your imaginings a few short months before. And critically, I said to them, as I would say to you, that creativity is not the consequence of action, creativity is not the motivation of action, it is by definition the consequence of action. You have to do what needs to be done and only then ask whether it was possible or permissible. Pessimism is an indulgence, despair an insult to the imagination, just as orthodoxy is the enemy of invention. An old friend of mine, Jim Whittaker, who was the first American to climb Everest, said something wonderful. He said, if you're not living on the edge when you're young, you're taking up too much space. And another great friend of mine, Terence McKenna, the late Terence McKenna, once said to me that you had to dream the impossible, and the great message of the mystics and the sadhus is the world won't let you down, it lifts you up. You jump off the cliff and you find yourself hurling through the abyss only to land on a feather bed. And of course, I knew that a lot of these young students graduating, and the older students indeed, were desperately worried about finding a job. And on that point, I urged caution, because the word job is derived from the medieval French word gobert, meaning to devour. My father had a job all of his life. He called it the grind. I used to, as a little boy, think that he went off to work and came home every day a little bit shorter. I've never really had a job, and I don't think many students will find a single occupation into which to squeeze an entire life. But what they do need to do, is what we all need to do at all ages, is to work. And that's got a more beautiful ring to it, because the word work comes from the Anglo-Saxon root meaning to create, to inspire, and to create something beautiful. And I always say to people that the work you do should just be a lens through which you view and experience the world, and only for a time. The goal surely should be make living itself, the act of being alive, one's vocation, knowing full well that nothing can be planned or anticipated, no blueprint found for something as complex as a human life. But if you can remain open to the promise of the new, the potential of the unimagined, then of course, as we all know, magic happens and a life takes form. And the best things come from those incapable of compromise. I always say to parents of my students to be patient, because it takes time for an individual to create a new world of possibilities, to imagine and bring into being something that has never existed before, which is the full dimensions of a realized and complete life. And I always ask the students to give more thought to the person they'll become than the vocation they'll pursue. Money really does in the end mean very little, but acts of compassion and loving kindness radiate through the centuries, through eternity. And I share a story, one of the most profound stories I ever experienced myself when I was very young, living in the mountains of Colombia. A Kamsa Indian, Pedro Hibioi, said to me something I've never forgotten. He said, in the first years of your life, you live beneath the shadow of the past, too young to know what to do. In your last years, you find that you're too old to understand the world coming at you from behind. In between, there is a small and narrow beam of light that illuminates your life. And so if we can look back on a long life and have a sense that we've owned our choices, as you know, there's very little ground for resentment. Bitterness, of course, comes to those who look back on a life of choices imposed upon them from the outside. So the greatest creative challenge for all of us at all ages is to be the architect of our own lives. And so the key thing there is to never compromise and always continue this process of allowing our destiny to find us. Now, all of that sort of rings true to me even at the age of 65. But unlike Chris, I kind of had a different response to that threshold. I really have tried to resist this sort of pop notion of 70 becoming the new 50, this illusion that we're somehow still in our prime, that we can set new goals, take on new adventures, reach for that elusive prize, run through that bucket list of dreams, go for those breasts we never had, or sow our heads with a new forest of hair. No rest for the striver. I struggle with the entire idea of an active retirement because, for one thing, I have nothing to retire from because I've never had a job. And I don't have any bucket lists of dreams because all of my life I've lived my dreams. And at least for now, I still have my hair. To me, retirement is not a moment, but a passage that one accepts with sort of gratitude and grace. The notion that you've had your day, that whatever mark you're going to leave on this life has been left, and that it's time to recognize that your ambitions, by definition, have fundamentally been realized, and that's just time to get out of the way. Because what is life, after all, but a story we lose the power of comprehending as we get old? And I like the idea of getting out of the way, of stepping off the stage, of leaving the playing field to a new generation. I mean, God, what could be more depressing than an aging rock and roll star, an avatar of youth reduced to the stages of Vegas, Bob Dylan singing Forever Young and really believing it. I had the most horrific experience recently. I was invited by Paul Allen's people on one of those cruises where he invites 200 people that he wants to get to know. Well, he was unfortunately dead, but his sister kept the cruise going, and I was invited to go. And on the last night, and it was a glorious, lots of fun, wonderful people. On the last night, as a great treat, who did they fly in but Ringo Starr and his band? It was atrocious. It was embarrassing. It was awful. Anyway. And there's kind of a what does Mick Jagger actually see in the mirror in the morning? Think about it. At least Keith has the decency to recognize that he's here by a miracle. But there was this kind of like this weird mania of this perpetual striving. As Epicurus, one of my great favorite writers, said, "Nothing is enough for the man to whom enough is too little." And Epicurus believed that the best possible life was one of pleasure. He had absolutely no concerns about death. As he put it, death is nothing to us as long as we're alive, and when it does come, we are not alive. So the absence of life is not some kind of evil. Death, he claimed, is no more alarming than the nothingness that exists before birth. Now, this begs the obvious question of anticipation, which for some of us is a bit disconcerting. It's like the Catholic priest, who's asked, well, why don't you rush home to heaven? He says, I know I'm going home, but I'm not homesick yet. But Epicurus was maybe somewhat disingenuous, but he was sincere in believing that old age was the pinnacle of life. He wrote that the young man wanders, uncertain of his beliefs. The old man has docked in the harbor, having safeguarded his true happiness. So here's the rub. To deny that we are old is to not deny that we are mortal. But the clock is ticking. And math alone tells me that there are only so many more sunrises that I'll live to experience. Biology dictates that at some point I will hit the wall of decrepitude. I probably will lose my mind. I probably will be slobbering at my breakfast cereal. But the critical thing is between now and then lies what Epicurus called a beautiful valley, considered by him the most precious phase of all existence, the glory of just being authentically and contentedly old, of allowing life to slow down, not ramp up, to practice walking meditation, not this absurdity of counting our steps as we go through the forest. The idea of a hill to be climbed at a leisurely pace, the body flowing and fluid. The other day I was with some monks on my island in Bowen in Vancouver, and I came to this hill that I've always stormed up but I decided to walk up it deliberately so that my heart rate would not increase, so I wouldn't have cardio exercise. And for the first time in my life, a hill was a pleasant experience. And so the idea is not to sprint through the rest of life, but to embrace it with dignity. Idleness not as boredom, but as an essential precursor to play. The recognition that it is simply a privilege to still be alive, a privilege just to be. And I like the idea also of disappearing in old age. One of my favorite poets did that, Lew Welch, and he simply evaporated and was never seen again, like the wandering sadhus of India. But before he left us a short poem. And he said, "I saw myself a ring of bone in the clear stream of all of it, and vowed always to remain open to it, that all of it could flow through." A ring of bone. Ring is what a bell does. Thanks very much.
Can we get another?
We're going to get another picture. But I take it you don't want those tickets to the Rolling Stones concert
Well, no,
here in
I
town.
didn't say that.
The Stones are here at the end of the month.
I know.
Okay.